We're going to jump in to our final panel of the day, which is called Telling Our Own Stories, Media Accountability and Elevating Ignored Voices. And I'm going to give very brief bios of our panelists. And again, you all can read their full bios on our website and on their websites. But just want to make sure we orient to who's on the panel with us. So joining us remotely is Rahsaan New York Thomas, who is a phenomenal independent journalist who has worked on a number of projects, including the Ear Hustle podcast at a San Quentin State Prison, now San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, but also has worked for the Marshall Project, the San Quentin News, and a number of other outlets, and has done that kind of journalism both inside and outside of carceral settings. Yawu Miller, to my right, is the former senior editor of the Bay State Banner, which is a kind of legacy black paper in the city of Boston. And he has written for the Banner since 1988, but recently retired and coming out of retirement to join us today. Adrienne Johnson Martin, at the end, is the first executive editor for MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism, based in Memphis, Tennessee, and has been a journalist for a long time, managing editor of Duke Magazine, Duke University's alumni publication, writer at the LA Times, where she was part of the 1994 Pulitzer Prize-winning team that covered the Northridge earthquake, and has been building out this kind of independent journalism project in Memphis. And Morgan Elise Johnson is the publisher of the Triibe, which is a digital media platform reshaping the narrative of Black Chicago and giving ownership back to the people, in her words. And Morgan's purpose is to make and protect Black history so that future generations will know who we are, as she says. She's a filmmaker and doing that visionary work with the Triibe. And in particular, I'm going to start with you, Morgan, on our panel today to talk about the Reframing Crime Narrative series that you all have been putting together. So, you know, as part of this series, you all have covered a bunch of different subtopics, and I wondered if you could kind of talk us through what is the vision behind that series? Why was that one of the kind of projects that you started to put together, and how did you pick those specific components of the series and who to feature and whose voices to center in that?
Thank you so much for having me. The Triibe is spelled with 2 I's. We started the Triibe with a specific mission to reshape the narrative of Black Chicago. And we all know what the dominant narrative of Chicago is. You know, it's violence, and specifically gun violence. So we came onto the scene with the purpose to really critique the media about how they interact with Black communities and how they perpetuate trauma. And to try to repair those relationships. And as we got to know the community and got to know the media, we realized that there's certain cycles of storytelling that happens. And when the warmer months come, we know that a certain type of crime spikes. And so we started to call that in our newsroom crime narrative season, where just like all of the crime reporting was going to start and proliferate all these terrible stereotypes specifically about Black people. So last year we decided, let's be proactive about this. Like, why don't we just prepare a bunch of narratives to counteract and challenge crime narrative season, which we know is going to start Memorial Day weekend. It's like a weird thing where it's like, how many shootings are there going to be Memorial Day weekend, and how is it going to compare this year versus like previous years? And then that's going to be an indictment on the mayor, as if the mayor can somehow stop crime from happening, you know, as soon as they get into office. So we wanted to get ahead of crime narrative season by preparing a series of articles that can just spark productive conversations about crime and like why these cycles of crime happen, and also to do some more solutions oriented approaches to let people know that like there are people in the community working towards this, and like you can do something to be proactive about making your community safer.
Thank you for that. Rahsaan, maybe we can jump to you and hear about some of the work that you've done, starting from inside San Quentin. I think in particular, you've done a lot of work around trying to problematize the language that's used in reporting to be more humanistic. I wonder if you could tell us about what that project looked like.
Yeah, that was a project that started with Sanquit News and then ended up branching off to the Marshall Project. And it was just about like understanding that if you don't see people as a human being, then you don't see why crime happens. You think people are evil or you disregard the humanity of people, then we never identify root causes and never deal with them. And so it started with that. But also I want to mention two other things real briefly. I'm also the co-founder of Empowerment Avenue. And what we are, we're middlemen. We connect incarcerated people to outlets on the outside, like get them published in the New York Times, get them their submittable to get their articles submitted to publications and stuff like that. And I'm also the co-founder of the San Quentin Film Festival. And we just had a film festival instead of state prison with the objective of taking the narratives back. Everybody's making stories about us, but not with us, and profiting off it and winning awards. And we're not getting our cut and the story's not being told as accurately as it could be. And so those are other ways I'm combating narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I want to get to kind of broader the topics, but I also want to hear the specifics about each of your experiences first. So Adrienne, let's turn to you in terms of figuring out, in founding MLK 50, right, as the sort of executive editor, one of the projects that happened in the last couple of years was, I saw a post on the website that you all had hired a reporter as a labor reporter and then switched her beat to be criminal system focused. And I wonder if you could talk us through that editorial decision. What did that look like and kind of why that transition in that moment?
I think there were two threads to that. So one was just organizationally, we really tried to be in-house an organization that is reflective of the kinds of things that we ask the community to consider. And so because we interrogate power, because we investigate poverty as if it is a crime, we end up looking at systems. And systems are layered, right? And they're connected. And so we really wanted to align our beats so that to reflect that, to show that housing is connected to health, and to everything is sort of working together under that umbrella of poverty. And so looking at that beat, and also it helps us work more collaboratively when our beats sort of overlap, and makes us a more powerful force in the community as reporters. And so we, just in reevaluating the beats, we thought we need to look at public safety and broaden that idea. And it's not just about the criminal justice system, it's bigger than that. So that was one line. The other thing was, when that happened, was Memphis moved into a different era when in sort of September 22, Memphis, Shelby County and the Memphians elected a new DA that had a different focus, was in law and order. He was immediately labeled as a progressive by the legacy media. I can tell you that that's not possible. In Tennessee, you cannot be a progressive, but that was, so he was already targeted by that label. And then sort of 3 months after that was when Tyre Nichols was murdered. And that changed everything in terms of the way people understood things and the way we had to sort of move, and with the great phrase, sort of grappling with historical continuity, like that became very, even more critical. So we had to shift in that way as well.
Absolutely. And Yawu, you've been doing this work for a long time, and in particular, I think with the banners coverage, I feel like I saw over a period of many years, in some ways, one of the themes of our day has been about this idea of historical continuity, right? The way that we're kind of caught in a time loop when it comes to these issues and the way they get reported. And I wonder if you could talk to us about kind of what your editorial approach was like on the banner, and thinking about what community safety looks like and how to cover that, where you're speaking to people's lived experiences, but also the way that you would encounter the same kinds of patterns of relationships between police and communities in particular?
When I started at the Banner in the early 1990s as managing editor, you know, it was me and one full-time reporter and some freelancers, and I recognized right away we didn't have the capacity to cover crime the way daily newspapers did. If we reported on crime, you know, we'd come out a week later and the story would have already, you know, they would have moved on to the next story. So it just didn't make sense. What I did have a sense of, though, is, you know, as somebody who grew up in the city, that, you know, the first time I got pulled over, I was 10, I was riding through Brookline, which is a wealthy suburb of Boston, and a cop pulled over to the curb and said, you know, wait, I'm gonna see if any bikes were stolen. And, you know, as I came to understand what the Fourth Amendment and the 14th Amendment were, and sort of, you know, that this, you know, it kept happening to me as I got older. You know, I understood that the policing that you read about in the newspapers wasn't the lived experience of people in the community. And, you know, as a Black newspaper, our job is to write from the perspective of the community. So the other papers left the daily papers, all the other news publications left a big hole that we could occupy, where, you know, we reported on criminal justice policy, we reported on police practices. And that was primarily like our coverage of crime. There was, you know, some coverage of like trends in crime and sort of what police, you know, police responses to trends in crime. But, you know, primarily I think we got to be known more for reporting on police abuse and overreach. And, you know, there was a lane for that, and I think there still is.
Yeah, I think that is a great way to lead us into the next topic I want to cover, which is thinking about this tension in news of being reactive to events in the world versus proactive in shaping people's understanding of in particular in the realm of community safety, right? And I think the point you just made was as a matter of constraints on resources, right? That you didn't have the capacity to be reactive to crime in the way that that we often think about the nightly news doing that kind of reporting. But also that's not the reporting that necessarily is going to inform a community and help them think about what keeps communities safe. So I wonder if you all could talk about that, that tension between in journalism being reactive versus proactive and kind of shaping and thinking about the power that editors and journalists play in that process. Let's maybe start with Morgan.
I don't know that it's always that mainstream media is being reactive. I mean, I think you're right, but it's more than that. It's also like a capitalistic model. TV news has a slot that they need to fill every night, and they know that people are gonna watch because they kind of want to be terrified. You know, they expect the crime news now. So in Chicago, even when there are days where there is no crime, ABC7 is going to import a crime story from Phoenix where something happened. So they're not going to pause and say, hey, there was no violence in Chicago today. Here's what's working. There's no media like infrastructure for that to be happening. But that also would take work, right? That would take more reporting. Police narratives are very easy to reproduce. The police, I mean, we talked about this earlier, but the police have media departments. They put out press releases where they basically write the narrative for the news. And it's a process that can be easily replicated with very little work for newsrooms. And I think they just take that and it's sensationalized. It's going to get a broad audience, and it doesn't take a lot of work. So what we're doing with the Reframing Crime series, it takes a lot of work, and then it may not get as many eyes. I mean, you all saw it. I'm here at Harvard, but you know, I have to make sure that people on the block saw it, which is much more difficult. So we have to take the steps to go out into the community and do much more engagement work around the series because it's more in depth and it's not used to like the certain media diet that people are used to.
I think that, you know, I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that question about reactive versus proactive, but I think your point just leads to both of those last 2 points that Yawu made, and then Morgan leads to another set of questions about resourcing, right? And in particular, thinking about, you know, you all have worked on kind of independent projects, right, where you're figuring out how to sustain these initiatives. And Rahsaan, I know you're talking about an Empowerment Avenue in particular, right, trying to help people place into legacy media, but you're also doing your own journalism. And the rest of you on this panel here in person are also kind of behind independent media initiatives where you have to figure out funding and staffing and what the resources look like in, yes, a profit-driven market in most places. So I wonder if we could talk about those dynamics and how to, this is a question that keeps coming up today, but how to get resources to cover communities in their whole complexity. Rahsaan, maybe you can start us off.
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say I just totally agree with what Morgan was saying. I think that when it bleeds, it leads is a strong narrative to fight against. And so Empowerment Avenue is getting like 20 stories or more a month out, but it's like, what is the public reading? The shock narrative, right? And there are counter stories that are really good too. Like I'm seeing movies like Sing Sing. I don't know if you guys saw it.
Yes.
But it's an amazing movie where no one gets shot. There's not one sex scene, not one explosion, and it's masterful. And one of the things that made it masterful is 5 formerly incarcerated men played themselves. There's daughters, and I can go on and on. And so I think that it's really hard to reach people in print. And so we need the resources to reach people in other mediums, like film. But even with print, we need the resources to market and promote. When me and my folks make a film and all award-winning films, our budgets be around 40,000. But other people can make this, get 1 million to play with, or 2 or 3 million to play with to make the same movie, the same length movie. And so it's just a matter of like, how do we get those resources? A big question that we need to answer. And how I'm trying to do it is just, the film was one way. A whole bunch of Hollywood people in to see the talent, to see what they're bypassing, to see what's not included. And it's working a little bit. Like there's going to be a lot more inclusion, a lot more distribution deals for films coming made by system impacted people. But so much more needs to be done. We need to like create ways to generate revenue ourselves some kind of way. I hate that amazing filmmakers make a film and they still asking for money for their next film, right? We need to figure out ways to generate revenue so we can be self-sufficient, because that business model is in place and it benefits who it benefits. And I don't think they're going to let it go or share resources just to empower somebody else.
Adrienne, maybe you can talk to us about what this looks like in your organization.
I think really it gets to forming partnerships. I mean, and not just with other media entities, but with community organizations, understanding that you can get to everything, and that journalism in itself, if you're working in a model that's not extractive and that these stories belong to all of us, then you can pull in all different kinds of people to help tell these stories, and also they'll understand the value of them. And so that's kind of how we spread, are able to do a lot of the work that we do.
Go ahead.
It's like for us, the monetary resources just weren't available, and like Adrienne said, partnerships. So for instance, one of the most difficult things when you're zooming out and looking at a trend is getting information from the police department. They won't respond. If you press them, they'll respond, weeks or months later. They're supposed to respond within 10 days and, satisfy your request for information. We're looking for data on things like how many people are arrested for trespassing in a 4-year period. And, they just wouldn't get up off that data. And what the strategy I landed on was to use the city council, like find a friendly city councilor, ask them for the data, ask a friendly attorney to word the request, and then pass that along to the city councilor, and then get the data from them. But it's for-profit news, it's been, particularly small community newspapers, it can be a struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, part of what we're seeing in the kind of local news media landscape right now, right, is these big conglomerates like Sinclair coming in and kind of buying up all the local news media. And that is not only kind of squeezing out more independent initiatives like all of the ones that you all have worked on, but also creating this sort of top-down narrative that's being mass distributed, right, through outlets that are trusted as if they are local news. So I wonder if you all could talk about how, to what extent that you feel those pressures, that those dynamics, or if you're kind of outside of that, and how that, how, if outside of that, you can kind of leverage that as an accountability structure, right? Like, what does it look like to be embedded in your community away from this sort of more diffuse but top-down structure of local news capture?
Okay, so the right buying up all the media. Um, Like, let's be real. This election has really shown us just how weak the left is. Like, where is the money? I really don't understand it. Chicago is in, I mean, we have a very like robust media ecosystem. So I would say that we're actually in a better position. I don't know that the tribe could have thrived in another city in the same way that we have in Chicago, just because there's so much community media and we kind of validate and uplift each other. It's not like this spirit of competition. But when it comes to the more legacy publications, there is kind of like that friction. And what I'm seeing is that they do allow kind of like right-wing misinformation and disinformation sources to set the agenda of just like what we're going to be talking about, like what our societal priorities are right now, which is always crime, but a certain type of crime, because it's not like they're like securities fraud is the agenda today. You know, it's always the same type of crime. And what the tribe does is we try to just disrupt that by openly critiquing the media. But it's not just the news media. Chicago is also like this propaganda central, like the Dick Wolf universe of like Law and Order, Chicago PD, Chicago Fire, Chicago, you know, all of that stuff is happening in Chicago. And there's all these feelings and ideas about like what CPD really is. It's not even perpetuated in the news media. It's like embedded in our culture. And that's what I'm seeing has no kind of like counter presence on the left. Like there's no one funding stories of like community organizing and activism, like activists as heroes. And Chicago has this really, really like robust community organizing tradition that doesn't get uplifted in the same way as like police are as heroes. So.
Yeah, I mean, Rahsaan, that connects back to the point you were making about thinking about our media landscape beyond news media, right? In terms of thinking about film and what are the other ways that communities need to see themselves in order to also kind of disrupt those internalized narratives, right, that we're fighting against? Because I think you're right that the right is setting the terms of the landscape on which these conversations even happen, right?
And if I can just add, though, it doesn't take much to be disruptive. The tribe, people think we're like this big newsroom. There's 8 of us. 4 is a part of the editorial team. I'm the publisher by myself, raising all of the money for the whole organization. And we're named as one of the most powerful organizations in Chicago, like in the top 50 list with like the governor. So it's like, we're just like, what? And it's simply because we just do truth telling. Like anyone just who decides to cut through the noise and tell the truth, like you can just rise into power. It doesn't necessarily have to be you're putting out 20 articles every day. We just are very, very intentional about what stories we tell and when. Like we time them out. Like I said, it's violence narrative season. We know it's coming as soon as it gets warm. Like be prepared. Like we know what mainstream media is going to do. Have stories ready to counter them, make them evergreen. Promote the same stories over and over again until they reach your audience. They don't have to be reactive, you know, they can just be stories with a long shelf life, and that's how we work and survive.
Adrienne, I wonder if you could talk about how that also works in terms of thinking about this shift in not only language but framework, from thinking about crime reporting to thinking about, and I know that this is the work that Cheryl does too, thinking about kind of public safety journalism or community safety or reimagining public safety, right? To what extent is the kind of long form, deeply investigated work that you all are producing kind of shifting the groundwork too for how communities think about themselves? And you talked about the relationship between political change that's happening and how that affects the reporting. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about that.
Well, I think one of the things that we sort of start with in our thinking is that first is just really exploring the idea of what safety even means. Because I think sometimes we're using language that the community isn't exactly tied into. So Memphis is a majority Black city, low wealth. There are many people in Memphis who, just like live with the contradiction of living in communities that have a lot of crime, and so wanting the police, at the same time understanding that the police often are there to kill them.
Yeah.
So it's just like, even when you're talking to them, they might say to you like, yeah, we need to lock these people up. And then at the same time, they talk about someone they know that has been locked up and it's unjust. So first you have to like sort of really take the time to tease through, as someone else said, like what is it that they're really talking about and what even safety means to them to feel safe. So there's that, you start with sort of that level. And I think the Tyre Nichols case was really an interesting reflection point for the city because as people talked about narratives that were built, the first narrative that came out sort of nationally was like the focus on, oh, well, these were 5 Black officers. So then it becomes, well, see, it's not about race. Well, Memphis is majority Black. A lot of police are Black. Like, that's not surprising. Memphians picked up on that right away. Then it was this idea of, well, it's a few bad apples. But, it wasn't just the police that were involved in there, it was EMT. It was it kept everything that was being thrown at it, it kept the answers, and what people could see went back to policing and the system, and that there was a whole apparatus. I mean, these police officers the youngest was 24 and the oldest was like 32. Two of them had been on the force 2 years. I think the longest had been like 7 years. So it didn't take very long for them to be the kind of people that would beat literally their peer to death in the street, right? People understood that right away and understood that that means something is wrong. That's not individuals. That's a thing that's happening. That's a culture. Yeah. Not to mention, this police force is led by a Black woman. So, all of that was exposed. And I think that helped with people, with the work that we do and helping people understand it and think through it and see, and led to eventually the ordinance against pretextual stops. All of that understanding that we could also present and tease out led to the activism that caused policy change. The problem is Memphis is, politically a blue dot in a red state. And so the state could respond and preempt their ability. So, but it didn't undo the understanding. And that's what's important, because you can build on that.
I think that's such an evocative example and goes to what I want to go to next, which is thinking about when you are doing a different kind of reporting, how does that enable policy change or culture change in a different kind of way? And in particular, I think when we're thinking about criminal system reform, there are such buzzwords for data-driven or evidence-based reform, right? This notion that in order to disrupt this system that was built based on weaponized stories of specific individuals who experienced harm resulting in massive legislation, right? We heard about 86% of laws passed for a specific individual were based on these salacious, anomalous cases, in most cases, about white women victims, right? Was a statistic from the last panel. When you think about the way that system, which is our current system, right, was not data-driven or evidence-based necessarily, but in order to disrupt it, there is this call from reformers to say we need a research base in order to start pulling back. I wonder if you could talk to us about that imbalance and how the information ecosystem can address that imbalance, right? What can you all do as journalists to try to help us not require mountains of evidence in order to start pulling apart this system that we know is sort of built on smoke and mirrors?
I think in Boston, there's been for 20 years, Black and Latino elected officials have been saying we need to spend less money on policing and more money on prevention, on youth development programs, because police show up after a crime happens and then find a culprit, whether that person did it or not, and then they get a prosecution. That's how it works. So there was an opening after George Floyd murder, and then we had a mayoral election 2021 where most of the city council candidates and most of the mayoral candidates said they were in favor of cutting the police budget and reinvesting in the community. The mayor who was elected kind of reversed that position when she got into office and said, actually it's me now and it's better, so we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Crime in Boston is at an all-time low. The crime rate is half what it was 18 years ago. The murder rate is lower than it's been in anyone's memory. Fear of crime, when you look at national statistics, fear of crime is like at a 6 or 8 year high. And we certainly have elected officials who are fear mongering. So last year, there were a quartet of city councilors who represented the most conservative constituencies in Boston who are saying that we need metal detectors in schools and we need uniformed police officers in all schools. And the city had just gotten away from uniformed police officers in schools. One of the councilors said we need to hire 300 new officers every year. Yeah,
he's saying it every day on the internet.
Right. Okay. At one point, one of the four councilors asked for the school department for information on sexual assaults in schools. And the school superintendent said there were 744 instances of sexual misconduct, but we don't make determinations on sex assault. The DA does that. So she just repeated 744 sexual assaults, which is absurd because over 180-day school year, that'd be like 4 a day, more than 4 a day, it would overwhelm the juvenile justice system. It'd be more sex assaults than occur in the rest of the city. It just didn't make sense. So, I wrote like, here's what was said, here's what, the counselors said, and, they just kept repeating it. It was absurd. It was like you're in a alternate universe. It's difficult to counter that narrative because, they're on social media. And, I did some community listening sessions and found that like 64% of people who I interviewed, all Black and Latino, said that they get their news from social media. Only 28% said they get their news from newspapers. So I think, there's a bit of an uphill battle. And I think that, the data is out there in many instances. It's not always difficult to find, but the stories that people tell are more powerful at times, or the lies that people tell, quite frankly, depending on what the white media in our city or the mainstream media, how they run with it.
Yeah. I want to break for questions in case others have questions.
So once again, it's Chendrag with a question. Thank you all. This is very, again, really insightful. So many thoughts. I guess I wanted to go, earlier I was talking to Morgan and you were talking about the fact that you all at some point in Triibe's process started having community talkbacks as a really important way that you were, I guess, hearing from the community you're accountable to. And I just would invite you to talk a little bit more about that, and I mean, other panelists about how are you actually getting feedback from the community you're accountable to, and does it involve, because when you said that, Morgan, it kind of reminded me of what Johans was calling for, like a way of actually also being with the folks, you know, in the community that we want to reach and serve. So yeah.
Okay, so a little bit more background about me. I don't come from journalism. I come from film and documentary. So my approach to community comes from that. We think about audience really as we're thinking of crafting stories and films. You know, like, who is this film for? So I take that approach to the tribe. I think about, you know, every story that we do is not for the same audience. You know, we think about audience for every single story, and then that shapes how we ask our questions and our impact strategy, because we also have impact strategies for the articles that we put out as well. So during seasons, like election seasons, our impact strategy may look like, first of all, we lead with explainers. We want people to understand the language that is going to come with the more in-depth investigative stories. So we start with language, graphic cards that go out on social media of like, here's what this means, here's what this means, here's what this type of institution does. So we start with that. Then we tell the stories, we do the reporting, and then we go out into the community to bring the story to people. And I think that's what makes the difference a lot of time, and just kind of like translate, because sometimes a lot of things are lost in translation. So we have to be face to face with community, and it also helps to build trust. And that means going into the neighborhoods where they are, ordering some fried chicken and having everybody sit down and talk. So yeah, it's that simple.
Hi, I want to thank each of you for the work that you're doing, first of all, and I want to ask everyone in the room, go and sign up for the newsletters of all of these wonderful Black-owned, Black-led media outlets. That support is really important, and I think one of the things that has come up like repeatedly that I know each of your outlets do very well is this people first language that we've been talking about throughout the day. In my day job at the Black Media Initiative, we did research on Black media and its comparison to mainstream media, and this was something that came up so clearly. Like using explicit terms of care when talking about people, explicit focus on the way safety impacts children, the way safety impacts people who are currently incarcerated, the way these different issues impact folks. So I'd love if you all could just talk about some of the examples, or what are some advice you would have for other journalists in really having a people first ethos in their reporting and the language that they use.
Rahsaan, do you want to lead us off?
That's a tough question. The language project with the Marshall Project was supposed to settle the issue. And yeah, and ironically, New York State, the governor there, she stopped using that language in their DOC. And California stopped using that language in their prison system. And the newspapers are still using it. Bipolar though, it seems like it's per journalist, right? Like in the New York Times, you might read one journalist using it and one journalist not using it in the same paper. And so it just feels like people just don't respect it, you know? So it's still a struggle. It's something that's supposed to be over with. That box check. Let's move on and let's get deeper to some other issues, right? That's just the issue that leads to it. I mean, if you don't see me as human, like where can we go from there, right? We can't go nowhere if you don't at least see me as human, as equal, as worthy of anything. And so I'm hoping to get past that issue and move on to the next thing, right? But we still stuck after all this time. And this is something I've been going on since the 60s. I invent this stuff, you know? This is crazy. So yeah, I don't have an answer for that, except that I keep using it and keep letting reporters know that this is the way we're supposed to do it. Not out of sympathy, just being neutral. You know what I mean? Like as a journalist, you're not supposed to parrot the words of the state. And the COs need to see us as inmates in order to have a conscience, right? In order to lock us in ourselves and or be ready to shoot us with pepper sprays, they can't see us as human beings. They needed that language, and they don't even use it no more in New York or California. So I'm baffled. Next, I'm baffled.
Anybody else?
I think talking about the approach, one of the things I think that happens is I think a lot of media entities are actually sort of afraid of what their audience might say. Like, and that it's, you know, oh, we'll talk to all these people and they won't say anything. And that is, you know, you're making a value judgment about your audience. And so you have to really reflect on, like, why do you think that way about your audience? And be, you know, you shouldn't be afraid of what your audience is going to say. I remember we did a piece where we, before the DA was elected, and a reporter came up with the idea, said, we should talk to the people that most have to deal with the DA. So we went to the court system, it's 201 popular, and we just asked people. And one person said, we asked him what kind of DA he wanted, and he said, I want a DA with a testimony. And that has stayed with me. You know, it was just so profound and beautiful what he was asking for. And that's the kind of thing you can get when you just go and talk to people about the issues and they're connected to it. They understand what they want and what they need from their community. And that's how you kind of have to approach the work. That it's not that everybody's out there, you know, crazy and uneducated. People actually are very smart and they can tell you what they want. And that's what you have to really understand.
Robert?
Thank you for this wonderful panel. My question is simple. How can research and data help the work that you do? And I don't mean evaluation. I mean research and just data broadly defined, if you could just reflect on that.
I mean, you know, I think it's tremendously helpful, like when the ACLU gets data, like they got data on you know, stop and frisk or FIOs, or like field intelligence observation reports in Boston, and you know, not surprisingly, it's like, you know, 90% of the people who are being stopped are African American, or, you know, 10% Latino and 1% white. You know. Yeah, it's helpful in just putting things in a broader context for us, because it's easy for us to tell individual stories of police misconduct, but you know, it's always way more difficult for us to get the big picture, and it oftentimes takes like a Herculean effort to get that data and then process it. The police will oftentimes give you data in a form that it's very difficult to pour through. And we just don't have the time or the resources.
Just to jump off of that, not only did the ACLU get those data, but those same data were then given to an independent researcher that was on contract. It was Jeff Fagan got access to those data and analyzed them, who's at Columbia, and produced an independent report that then also became the basis for changing public policy through the courts, right? That we have a decision in Massachusetts, a case called Commonwealth versus Warren, which is based in large part on the evidence of that stop and frisk report called Black, Brown, and Targeted, which is a report by the ACLU in 2014 that they're working on a reprisal of right now. There's going to be a new version of that report pretty soon. But those data, even though they weren't part of a trial court record, they became on appeal kind of attached to the briefing and became the basis for a decision by a Black justice on the Supreme Judicial Court, Jerry Hines, which said that based on the reality of young Black men in the city of Boston, the idea that somebody is fleeing from the police should not be a basis for reasonable suspicion to stop them, because it is just as likely that they are trying to avoid the, quote, recurring indignity of being racially profiled than that they are expressing consciousness of guilt that would suggest that that is criminal behavior to run from the police. So that is, I think that's such a good example, because it's not only that the way that research can kind of influence the reporting, but also we need the reporting of the stories. I mean, Yawu's done such exceptional reporting on the lived experience of people who are stopped constantly by the police, because judges also don't always know how to use the data. And the data alone, when you can present it in courts, doesn't move people's hearts and minds in the way that talking about a 16-year-old who every day that they walk down their street are surveilled or stopped changes people's attitudes in a different kind of way. And I think those linkages of thinking about how the reporting can influence the policy, can influence the research, and it's all kind of working in a feedback loop is part of what this convening was designed to do, right? Think about how do we all work together to kind of move forward in this way.
Yeah, I want to be real practical with you and say, like, the data is great. We need to know that y'all are working on it while you're doing it, because what happens is we get a press release of like this huge data dump that we're not expecting. Our editorial plan is already kind of mapped out. We have 2 reporters, nobody can cover it. And then mainstream media is not going to do it because they don't care. So if you know that we care about this, like, let us know when you're researching that you're doing it. Give us a timeline, allow us to be prepared, give us the subjects. Maybe we can run some stories that align with the work that you're doing so that there can be some kind of momentum happening. And also, you can write the article yourself. We need y'all on social media. We need y'all writing articles. We need you having more of a presence, which I know like y'all don't want to do. But at these conferences, these conferences could be used as a space to workshop some of these things. So instead of us having these panels, like, we can be at the table together talking about, okay, like, what is your editorial plan? What are you working on? What are you researching? And actually like working towards something and coming out of a conference with like a pathway to something transformative.
Right, I mean, yeah, just to second that, like, oftentimes when those things come out, they'll go right to the major dailies and give them an exclusive, even though we've been in the trenches, you know, reporting on that stuff for years, so, yeah.
Yeah, I would say don't forget about incarcerated journalists. They need that data, especially since they can't do a lot of research on the outside alone. And I think that those lived stories, I think feelings are more powerful than facts, like we talked about earlier. And so combining a lived experience with that data is critical to like covering both sides of what people need in order to think differently and move the crowd.
Well, we are at time. So I would love to give a huge round of applause to the panelists. And also to take where Morgan left off and say, you know, I think we do want it. We need your help to figure out how do we move forward together from here, and what does it look like to maintain some kind of container or collective where we're working together in a different way and being able to support each other proactively in doing that. So, you know, I hope that we can kind of stay connected and figure out what, if anything, that looks like moving forward. But also, there are so many people working at outlets around the country already trying to do that work too, and I don't want us to try to reinvent the wheel. And so part of what we've got to do is figure out, you know, like, as I think good organizers do, right? How do the mapping, do the kind of power mapping of what exists already, and figure out where can we plug in and amplify what's already happening, instead of trying to kind of claim a top-down ownership of it, you know? Thank you all.